Hey folks, this is AWS Simplified, and today we're going to be doing a step-by-step walkthrough for S3. So I figured I'd start this off by doing a quick overview. So at first we're going to talk about what S3 is. From there we're going to go on to why S3 is useful. And third, we're going to do a hands-on step-by-step walkthrough in the AWS Console, where I'm going to show you how to create a bucket, upload a file, and every setting in between. So firstly, what is S3? So S3 stands for Simple Storage Solution. There's three S's there, so that's where the S3 comes from, SSS. It was one of AWS's first offerings. It came out in 2006. Its main purpose is for object storage, so there's no real constraint here in terms of which types of objects that you can upload and store there. So I've listed a couple here. You can upload images, text, blobs, videos, anything really that you want. And the folder structure is something typical of what you see on like a Windows machine or a Mac machine. So you have folders and subfolders and then files located within them. And thirdly, it's extremely cost effective. So it's only 0.023 cents per GB of storage, and the cost actually decreases the more that you store on S3. Keep in mind that there's actually access costs as well. So for every GET request, every scan that you do, there's going to be additional costs, but they're fairly low. It also has built-in redundancy with 99.11 worth of durability. And what basically that means is that S3 is replicating your bucket and all its contents across three availability zones. So those are three different physical locations. So the likelihood that S3 is going to lose one of the files that you upload to S3 is extremely, extremely low. Moving on to why is S3 useful? So like I was alluding to before, it's a cheap, reliable way to store objects. It's got low latency and high throughput access to your bucket's contents. It could be easily used to host static websites. So this is a very common use case to use S3. So you can store your HTML, your JavaScript, and your CSS all in a bucket and host a website directly out of S3. And fourth, this is actually one of my favorite features of S3 is that you can integrate events on your S3 bucket with SNS, SQS, Lambdas for some very powerful event-driven applications. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this a little bit later in the video. And finally, this is actually a new offering. It's called Lifecycle Management. So there's mechanisms to shift away old data into long-term storage for cost reduction. And this kind of logically makes sense. Your most recently uploaded data will probably be accessed more frequently than old data that may be years or decades old. So from here, we're going to be doing a step-by-step walkthrough in the AWS Console. So it's going to consist of three main steps. Firstly, we're going to create a bucket. Second, we're going to upload a file, view the contents of a file, make sure it's downloadable. And third, we're going to talk about settings. So I'm going to be actually talking about all the settings throughout step 1 and 2, but there's some additional settings that you can set on the bucket and its contents after the bucket and file is uploaded. So let's get into it. Hey folks, so here we are in the AWS Management Console. And from here, I'm going to go to the Find Services section. I'm going to type in S3. And here we are at our S3 Management Dashboard. So there's a lot of overwhelming details here, so let's just take a look at what's going on. So over on the left, it's defaults to the buckets view, which is the view that we're in right now. That's what we're seeing. There's batch operations. Not going to get into this right now. It's a little bit more of an advanced topic. They just recently added this notion of blocking public access on an account level. And it's kind of interesting why. I think it's because they've been taking a lot of flack recently due to customers leaving their S3 bucket open or publicly available. And if you're a high profile company, if you have a publicly available bucket, you could potentially be leaking some confidential data. So they're really trying to push and make sure that people are aware of the settings that they can put onto their account to block this access. So that's why I think they're adding it here straight up. So from here, if you had some buckets, they would be listed here, but since we don't have any, there's nothing to really see. So I'm going to go to Create Bucket. After doing so, I'm greeted by this Create Buckets pop-up. So one of the first things that it's asking us is to pick a bucket name. So keep in mind this is DNS compliant here. So no like special characters, wildcards, like question marks, like stuff like that is just going to fail right away. So for this exercise, I'm going to use a name called credit card transactions, which is a common theme here for all my applications. One thing to keep in mind that these names are globally unique. So if someone else has a bucket named credit card transactions, when I try to click next here, this thing is going to fail. It's going to tell me you can't use the same name. So this is something to keep in mind once you're picking a name. You often want to be specific or use some kind of name spacing to separate and make your bucket name more distinct. Onto regions. So regions are useful because typically you want to select the region that is closest to wherever you're hosting your application. So say for instance, if you're hosting your application on site using your own machines, you'd want to pick whichever region is closest physically to you. So you'll get the lowest latency when your servers are making GET requests on the back end. So that's something to keep in mind. And the next step here is asking us if we wanted to copy settings from an existing bucket. We don't have any other buckets, so this isn't appropriate. However, if you had pre-existing buckets that some very specific access controls that are already enabled on them, you can copy those permissions onto this bucket so that you don't have to go through the pain of adding all of them one by one every time you create a new bucket. So clicking next here. So the next section is just general properties on the bucket itself. So one of the first ones that you have to decide on is versioning. So you need to decide whether or not you want to keep multiple versions of your objects as you modify them over time. So the way this works by default is that if you have an object that you upload to S3, there's a version ID that's associated with it. And say you make a modification on that object and you upload that same object and it overwrites the previous. S3 will by default, when this is enabled, keep that prior version on your S3 bucket. However, if you were to make a GET request with that specific ID, with a specific file ID, you would only get the most recent version. So you'd never get the older versions that are associated with it. So only kind of one can exist at any given point in time. That being said, if for some reason you wanted to grab the earlier instances, like the first version in this example, you can pass in a specific version ID as part of your GET request for this file, and you'll be able to retrieve that specific version. So if this makes sense for your application, it may be something that you want to enable. For us, it doesn't really make sense. So server access logging. So if you were to enable this, this would enable you to see logs that contain information like source IP of the person making the request, the date that it took place, the request ID that's associated with it, and the bucket that the operation took place on. So if that's useful for your application, then come here and enable this. Moving on to tags. So tags are, to put it simply, just a way of grouping your applications together with a common key. So if that's something you want to do, you can kind of group by these applications to determine how much they're costing. That's one of the kind of use cases that you can get out of applying tags to your components. Not going to be doing that here, so I'm just going to ignore that. So object level logging, I think of this as a more granular version of the server access logging. So this is going to give you extra information like the type of request that's being made, if it's a get, a put, a delete, an update, and everything in between. Keep in mind that there's additional pricing that comes as a result of this. So there's CloudTrail that's used for this. That's in contrast to these types of logs that use S3 delivery. So they'll kind of upload log files to this very bucket with regards to access patterns. So there's additional costs for both. Just be aware that if you'd like to use them, do the research and make sure an extra bill isn't a surprise. Default encryption here, we're not going to be using encryption, so we don't need to use it. If you want encryption at rest here, then you would enable this, but we don't, so we're not going to. If I expand advanced settings, so this is like object lock functionality. So if you want to enable this bucket to have locks on certain files or subfolders so that they cannot be deleted no matter what, you would enable this. Haven't used this personally, so I don't know what the process looks like to actually forcibly delete something. But this sounds like a good idea if you have like a very production dependent file or production dependent folder that cannot be deleted and you don't want to risk it being done by accident. So this may be something that's useful for you. And then, Lastly, under management, we have CloudWatch request metrics. So this is kind of interesting actually. So what enabling this does is that it allows S3 to give you kind of summary statistics on all the access patterns to your bucket over, I believe they by default do a 24-hour period. So it'll show you like the number of times certain clients call get or put or delete. So it's useful if you're trying to audit like where is S3 costing me? How can I reduce this cost? So this kind of metric will give you that kind of information that will enable you to make that decision. So moving on to the next section. This is something they recently added. So by default now, what they're doing is they're blocking the ability to make the content of your files in a bucket public. So that's what this is telling you here. So it's kind of a blanket statement saying disallow anyone from making any contents of this bucket public unless someone comes back here and disables this. So that's what this is asking you, and it's enabled by default here, which I think is a good thing. Keep in mind you can actually do this on a account level, and that's where this section over here corresponds to. So block public access on the account level. So you can do the same thing, so the same kind of policy applies to all the buckets in the account, so you don't have to do this every time. So after that, I'm going to leave this on by default. So moving on to the next step. Yeah, so this is just a review step. So asking us to confirm all the details, so credit card transactions, region, all the options that we just talked about. I'm not going to go over this again since we just glossed over it. From there, we're going to click Create Bucket. And boom. So that's pretty much it for step one. So you have your bucket here. And I mean, this is it. So we can click into it. And this is where we would see kind of a folder-like structure if we had one. So from there, it's actually fairly simple to upload a file. So we clicked into the bucket, so we're going to come back here to upload. You can drag or drop or add a file explicitly. So I'm going to go here and click Add File. So I have this transaction file here, which is basically a JSON array. So just kind of some transaction history. So the content here doesn't really matter, but just showing you what I'm uploading. So I'm clicking that guy. And going to go open, just telling you how large the file is. And we're going to click next. And from here, if you want to, during the creation step, add access for another AWS account, so you can have cross-account permissions, you can do that here. It's actually kind of interesting. So since we left that check mark enabled in the previous step about permissions, you can see that it's actually manifesting itself here in this message. So you can't grant public access because block public policy access settings are turned on for this bucket. So if you wanted to make this bucket or this file public, you'd have to go back and disable the block public access setting that we had enabled. So from there, we're not going to be toying with any of this. So we're just going to click next. And the next decision is tiering. So this kind of goes back to the overview step where I was talking about kind of tapering off your older data into longer term storage solutions that have lower costs. So by default, any file that you upload, it automatically selects this standard storage class here, and it's for frequently accessed data. So this has the 99.119 durability, and it's replicated over 3 availability zones. So this is great if you have your data that's going to be, like it says, frequently accessed. You need low throughput, high throughput, low latency, and reliability. So this is great by default. If you're not really sure what to use, I would say go with standard always. From there, it gives you a bunch of other options. So you have intelligent tiering, which is kind of like an automated tapering of your data into the other storage classes, which are cheaper but have penalties in terms of latency and throughput. So not going to get into this maybe for an advanced topic, but as we kind of go down this list, you can see there's different features of each of these. So standard, so 1A, so that corresponds to long-lived, infrequently accessed data. That's fine. So there's going to be cheaper costs associated with this. For this one, so there's only one zone, so there's less redundancy of the data, so higher chance of failure. For Glacier, so this is more archival. So after your data has been, and so they're suggesting 90 days here, after it's been after it has existed for a certain period of time, you can move it into this cheaper storage solution, and the penalty is that your GET requests are going to be minutes and in some cases hours, like they're saying here, and just kind of escalates as you go down. So you get cheaper alternatives as you go all the way down. So something to keep in mind. Also gives you some encryption options here. We're not going to be using encryption for encryption at rest, so it doesn't really matter. So you can actually attach metadata here to the file content itself. So it'll be accessible once you grab the object. You can read the metadata off of it. And this may be useful if you have, in this credit card transactions file that I'm uploading here, maybe you want to provide metadata about which customers that this file is related to and have that on the metadata object. So instead of the client having to download and traverse this object and figure out what all the unique customer IDs are, you can just put that in the metadata. Specific to applications, not going to really talk about it. Tags, we've talked about this before, just for grouping your applications together. Not going to be using it here. And then finally the review step. So we just basically did all the things here. We talked about each of these, so that's great. So we're going to go to upload. And there's our file. That's uploaded on S3 now. It gives you some details on when it was done and the storage class and the size. So if I click into this guy, I get some additional details. So this is the quote-unquote public URL that you can potentially give this to people to have access to this specific file. Since we do not have public access enabled on this account, if you were to try to click this, so I'm going to click the new tab, you're going to see access denied, so it doesn't work. So if you wanted to make it such that this file was accessible to your friends or whatever you're doing, you would need to go back to that previous step and ensure that A, public access is granted on the bucket level, and B, you actually enable this particular file to have public access, which is a separate step, and that's in the permission section. So from here, if we actually wanted to read this, see what's in here, we can open or download as, whatever you prefer. I'm going to click open, and Firefox is blocking stuff. That's fantastic. Let's download and open with. Yeah, sure. And there's the file that we just uploaded. Right. So now our file is on S3. So from here, I wanted to back it up and talk about some of the details. So we're going to back it up to the bucket level. So now we're at the bucket. Yeah, actually, hold on. There we go. So now we're at the bucket level. So after I click into the bucket, we get all these top bar settings that we can kind of play around with here. So changing any of these will change the properties on the bucket itself, so anything that lives under it will be affected by this. So let's go through each of these one by one and explain what they do. So some of these we actually already covered, so they're not. I'm just going to quickly go over them. So versioning, we already talked about that. Server access logging, we already did. Static website hosting. So this is useful if you need to enable CORS, which is kind of a requirement for cross-domain sharing of resources. So if you're using S3 for a static website, you need to enable this. I may get into this in a different video, but not for this one. Object level logging, we already talked about. Default encryption, we already talked about. We're not going to be using it. This we already talked about as well. This we already talked about as well. Actually, the only three things that we haven't really talked about are transfer acceleration, events, and requester pays. So let's go through each one of those because I think they're kind of interesting. So for transfer acceleration, this is fairly new. I think it's only a couple months old, and the use case that they're trying to solve here is that by default you get some pretty good throughput and latency when you're downloading and uploading files to S3. That being said, if you have some extremely large files, I'm talking about like terabytes or petabytes, this is that latency isn't going to cut it, right? I mean, if you're uploading 100 MB per second and you have a 5 terabyte file, it's still going to take you a considerable amount of time. And the same for petabytes. So what enabling this does is it gives, it's kind of a back-end optimization. So it enables S3 to take an optimal network path to maximize throughput and latency on the download or the upload of your request. So if you want to enable this, keep in mind that there's extra costs for this, and I believe it's pretty significant. So if you're going to enable this, be very, very aware of the costs that are going to be incurred out of it, because it's not cheap. So basically, if you enable this though, the only really limitation is going to be your network connection. So if you have like a 1 Gbps network connection, you'll probably be downloading at something pretty close to that. I don't have that kind of connection, so I can't really test it out, and I can't tell you, and I don't even have very large files, so that's something that you're going to have to play around with if you need this feature. So events. So this is actually my favorite part of S3. And it's my favorite part because I build a lot of event-driven applications where you have events that are happening in one place, and then you need to do some processing on another end based on the content of that event. So what this basically allows you to do is hook up an S3 event. So say for instance a put, inserting a file, a get or an update or a delete. And what it does is it'll broadcast that event to multiple different AWS services, and you can pick which one you want. Typically, you would pick SNS, SQS, or Lambda. So let's actually see what that looks like here. So if I clicked add notification there, it's going to ask me a name for this event. So let's say transaction update event. And it's going to ask you which S3 events do you want to be broadcasted to this kind of topic or Lambda or SQS, whatever you're going to use. So say I only really care about like put when new events are created, right? I want to be notified. I want to run some data processing. So this is useful for like, in our credit card application or whatever I'm talking about here. If a customer comes and uploads a batch object that contains thousands of credit card transactions, you probably want to know about that, right? You want to process that. You want to do some summary statistics, or maybe transform that data into a more long-term storage like a DynamoDB or RDS. So what this enables you to do is your SQS, your Lambda, or your SNS to have a message that gets broadcasted to it from S3. And this is extremely, extremely powerful. Again, it depends on your application. So there's some extra settings here. So it's asking you like basically filters. So if you have a subfolder structure, you can say only apply this policy to subfolders that have a specific prefix, and likewise suffix, so certain file types that you can specify here. And this is where we get to actually pick where we want to deliver it to. So you can deliver it to an SNS topic, queue, and Lambda function, which is what I said before. So this is a super cool feature, very underused, underrated. And yeah, I'd highly encourage you to check it out. Very, very cool stuff. And this is also fairly new, requester pays. So if you're in an ecosystem where you have multiple AWS accounts that are all sharing access to multiple to corresponding S3 buckets, and they're all located on separate AWS accounts, you may want to use a model where whoever's making the request pays the access costs, because by default, whoever owns the bucket pays the access costs. So you can kind of set this up this way so that if one of your customers wants to read off your S3 hundreds of thousands of times, sure, go ahead, but they can pay for it instead of you. Yeah, highly use case dependent, but I just wanted to gloss over that. Permissions. So yeah, this is where we set our block public access policy on before. So this is where you would come to edit it, and if you want to click edit, you can edit it here. Access control list. I'm not going to talk about this. And if you're using this, you are bad. You are a bad boy. Access control lists are bad. They're a legacy concept that are going away, or supposed to go away. And the only reason that they keep them is because people won't stop using them. Bucket policy is a far more modern way, and actually the suggested guidance from AWS when trying to control access permissions to a bucket or file contents. So I'm not even going to talk about this, so don't use it. Bucket policy, so this gets into if you want to grant specific users access to your accounts with specific permissions. What it requires here is a JSON object that tells S3 who in terms of what AWS accounts, what specific role, what user, what permissions that they'll have, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have some specific access restrictions you'd like to employ on a bucket or a file, you can come and do that here. CORS configuration, kind of glossed on it before, cross-domain access. If you're hosting the website, you probably need it. So the management section, true to its name, contains some features that are just for that, management. So like I was talking about before about kind of tapering off your older data into longer term lower cost storage solutions, this is where you would do it. So this would be through the Lifecycle feature here, and you can add a Lifecycle rule that, for instance, says after 60 days, if a file is in standard tier, put it into Glacier after a period of time. And so this is where you would add that rule to do that. I'm not going to show you how to do it here, maybe for another video. Replication. So this is for cross-region replication. So say you have a file in US East 1 and you want to replicate it in US West 2 for faster latency and throughput. You can do that here. So you can replicate a file or a set of files to a separate region. And like this says, analytics, so you can kind of see some access patterns here for analytics that kind of tell you about who and what people are doing with regards to your S3 bucket. Metrics, kind of similar, shows you, since we don't really have any of this yet, we don't really have any requests that are being made to this bucket. All these are going to be blank. But metrics on kind of access, latencies, stuff like that. So that's kind of what you would find here. And then finally, inventory. So I actually haven't used this one before. I don't know too much about it, so I can't really speak about it too much. So yeah, if we back it up all the way to S3 here, so let's go over what we talked about today. So I showed you how to create a bucket from scratch, and that's what we did here with its credit card transactions. I explained to you all the settings about what to set and not set, and maybe depending on your application you want to set for this specific bucket. And from there, we created a file within this bucket, and we uploaded it, and we talked about all the permissions and settings that are associated with doing that, and also all of these features here, so properties, permissions, and management. So hopefully this video was useful. If you like what you saw, please feel free to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. It means a lot to me. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.